The wind carried the dry smell of dust and sage across the lonely western valley, where tall grass bent like tired travelers, and the fading sun painted long shadows over the empty land. Out here, everything felt heavy, from the weight of silence to the stories people never dared to speak. Folks in these parts believed a person's past was stitched tighter than a saddle strap, and once it cut deep, it stayed like a mark forever. In this rough land of ranch houses, broken hopes, and untold journeys, choices often turned into fate long before a person realized they were stepping into it. That was the quiet rule in the old American frontier, and many lived under it like a silent law written in dust. No one understood that feeling more than the young woman who walked alone that evening, clutching at the torn edge of her dress, trying to escape the eyes of the world that once judged her as if she wasn't human at all. She didn't come from here. She had arrived only a few days ago by wagon, sitting in a corner with her head down, hoping no one would ask who she was or where she had come from. Rumors rose faster than prairie fire, and before she had even settled her feet on the dirt road, whispers passed from porch to porch. Some said she escaped trouble. Others believed she was running from someone dangerous. A few added she brought curse or danger along. In a town where strangers were measured first by fear instead of kindness, she carried a heavy burden no one cared to help remove. Her dress was old, partly burned near the hem, her hair tangled from days of travel, and her voice barely strong enough to ask for water. It was clear she needed help, but the only help she found were cold stares that seemed to push her out of sight. Meanwhile, on the far edge of town, a cowboy lived alone with a quiet heart and too many memories stored inside a small cabin built near the creek. People called him calm and well-mannered, a good rider, someone with strong hands and a steady mind. But few knew what rested behind his silence. He had lost more than he ever spoke about, and no matter how well he worked or how politely he spoke, life refused to let him fill the space inside his chest. He often rode at night, letting the moon speak for him, hoping the wind would take his hurt far away. He didn't expect someone lost to cross his path, nor did he believe any stranger could bring meaning back into a life that felt unfinished. Their first meeting happened by chance, when he was riding back to his cabin near sundown, and he heard soft cries by the old cedar tree that leaned toward the riverbank. When he stepped closer, he saw the young woman, her hands caught in a twisted piece of rope tied around the tree, as if someone had fastened it in anger or punishment. She wasn't tied fully, but part of her old dress had been snagged and wrapped tightly, leaving her unable to move without tearing it further. She didn't scream or fight, she only whispered for help with a trembling voice, scared that the wrong person might find her. The moment he looked into her eyes, he saw fear stronger than any danger he had known on the open plains. And something inside him felt responsible, as if fate had placed him in that exact spot. His horse stopped with a gentle snort, and he dismounted slowly, trying not to frighten her any further. She pulled her arms close, unsure whether to trust him or not. While he removed his hat and spoke in a calm tone that sounded like a warm campfire on a cold night, he told her he wouldn't harm her, and she nodded without saying much, though her eyes never left his hands. She was tired, weak, and her dress was trapped tight enough to bruise her skin if she forced her way out. For a moment neither spoke, as if the silence was safer than words, till she finally whispered, telling him the old cloth was hurting and she couldn't breathe well. She asked him gently to help her get free. He tried to loosen the rope and pull the dress away without tearing it, but the cloth was too tangled, worn, and stuck deep between the rough tree bark. It was clear there was only one way to release her. Her voice broke slightly when she said those words. Words that sounded simple but carried deep scars inside them. She asked him to pull it down to set her loose. It wasn't said with boldness or flirtation. It came from someone who had been trapped by fear for too long. He hesitated, not because of shame, but because he didn't want her to think he would take advantage. He told her he would only help if she felt safe, and she nodded once, holding her breath like she was letting go of the last defense she ever had. With gentle strength, he tore the trapped portion of the dress so it could release her from the tree, making sure his touch stayed respectful and his eyes stayed turned away from anything that might upset her dignity. When the cloth finally gave way, she stumbled forward and nearly fell, but he caught her shoulders to keep her from hitting the ground. Her breathing was uneven, not just from the pain, but from years of hidden hurt that no one else could see. She looked surprised that someone could help without asking anything in return. As she stood there shaking, tears formed in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. He spoke softly, saying she was safe now, and he placed his coat around her so she wouldn't feel exposed or cold. She closed her eyes for a second and leaned slightly toward him, not out of romance, but because it was the first moment in a long time when she didn't have to run. He placed a gentle kiss near her neck, not with desire, but with comfort. Like how someone tries to calm a frightened soul, or remind them that the world still carries a small piece of goodness. She didn't pull away. Instead, she breathed quietly as if that single act gave her strength to stand tall again. But the shadows of the valley weren't done with them yet. Just as he guided her away from the tree, footsteps echoed from the ridge above, slow but heavy, like someone who had been watching the entire time. The woman froze, panic rising again, while the cowboy tightened his grip slightly. Not to hold her back, but to let her know he wouldn't abandon her. Whoever was approaching seemed to know exactly where she had gone, and wasn't surprised to find her there. In that moment, everything changed, and the air grew thick with unspoken truth, fear, and the hint of a story that was far from over. Someone had come for her, and neither knew whether he carried justice, revenge, or secrets that would turn both their lives upside down. The steps from the ridge grew closer, slow enough to show confidence, and heavy enough to warn that the person did not care if they were heard. The cowboy shifted slightly, placing himself between the woman and the source of the sound, his hand close to his belt but not yet reaching for anything. The woman clutched his coat tightly around her body, her breath sharp and shallow, as if every memory she tried to leave behind had suddenly returned and stood right before her. When the figure finally appeared near the dying light, it was an older ranch hand from town. It's one known for talking more than he worked and stirring trouble wherever he sat. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he stared. Not at the cowboy, but at her, as if he had finally found the prize he had been hunting. The cowboy asked what he wanted, but the ranch hand only smirked, saying she belonged back near the settlement where she had arrived and should not be wandering around causing fear. His tone was filled with something darker than simple concern. It made the woman step back behind the cowboy as if she wished she could vanish into the wind. The cowboy did not raise his voice, yet something in him hardened. He said she was free to stand wherever she wished, and no one had the right to tell her otherwise. The ranch hand laughed, saying folks were already spreading stories, and that no decent ranch would want someone like her staying near the river. He claimed she came from a place no one trusted, and hinted that men might show up later, demanding answers with guns instead of words. The cowboy told him to leave, but before turning away, the man pointed a finger at the woman and said she would never outrun what followed her. When he finally walked back toward the ridge, she dropped to her knees beside the tree stump, overwhelmed. The cowboy knelt near her and waited quietly until she gathered her breath again. He then guided her to his horse, lifting her carefully so she would not slip, and rode slowly back to his small cabin near the creek. The land around them felt wider than usual, as if the sky itself watched what fate would unfold. The cabin was plain but warm, with a wood stove, a small bed, and a simple table made of pine. Lantern light filled the room with a soft glow, making it feel safer than outside where the world judged without mercy. She looked around with a mixture of relief and disbelief, unsure if she was allowed to stay, but also afraid to ask. He offered her a seat near the fire, fetched her a clean blanket, and poured some water into a cup. She held it with shaky hands, whispering a soft thank you, and for the first time, her voice did not sound like it was breaking. When she finally gathered enough courage, she began sharing parts of her story, not all at once, but in pieces, like torn cloth that still held hints of its original color. She had lived near a distant settlement where a family took her in after finding her wandering near a dried riverbed. She had no memory of her parents and no knowledge of her true birthplace. The family that raised her was strict and often treated her like someone who should constantly repay a debt she never asked for. As she grew older, the whispers about her background became louder. Some believed she carried misfortune only because her past was unknown. She worked hard, learned chores faster than others, and always kept quiet. But instead of earning respect, It made people cling to wild rumors. She began feeling like a shadow walking among others who had names, roots, and history. One evening, without warning, trouble arrived in her old settlement. A group of rough men claimed someone had taken a valuable item and insisted she was involved. She tried defending herself, saying she was nowhere near the place when it happened, but no one stood up for her. The men searched the home and found nothing, yet the accusation stayed like a brand on her skin. Soon after, someone suggested sending her away to avoid rising conflict. She was pushed near a wagon that took her across dry plains until she arrived near the town by the river. She hoped for a new beginning, but the same eyes of suspicion returned. She lived near an abandoned shed, trying not to be seen, until the ranch hand found her there earlier that day. He pressured her to go back with him, but she refused, and during the struggle, her dress caught on the tree, leaving her trapped until the cowboy discovered her. As she finished speaking, tears slipped down her face, but she wiped them quickly, not wanting to look weak. The cowboy listened without interruption, his expression calm yet filled with understanding. He did not try to question her any further, knowing some wounds reopened slowly and needed time to close properly. He told her she could stay at the cabin for the night and assured her no one would harm her as long as he stood there. She nodded, grateful, but still trembling, not from cold, but from fear that safety never lasted long in her life. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying the soft howl of distant coyotes. The cowboy stepped outside for a moment, his hand resting on the doorframe as he looked across the dark horizon. A strange tension settled over his heart, telling him the ranch hand would not stay quiet, and word would spread faster than dawn. He knew that people feared anything they did not understand, and once fear settled in, it rarely left without a fight. He had seen it with disputes between ranch owners, with cattle thieves, and even with good families torn apart by false tales. He sensed she was caught in something bigger than what she had shared, and whatever chased her had not ended yet. Still, he could not bring himself to turn away a soul who needed protection. When he returned inside, she was half asleep near the fire, wrapped in the blanket like someone afraid the warmth might disappear. He gently placed another log in the stove, making sure the room stayed warm through the night. Before resting, he locked the door, something he rarely did, and kept his lasso hanging near his chair in case trouble arrived sooner than expected. His thoughts drifted back to the moment he saw her trapped at the tree, remembering the fear in her eyes that did not belong to someone guilty, but someone terrified of what fate would do next, later. She opened her eyes for a brief moment and found him still awake. Sitting near the table with his hat on his knee, she whispered softly, asking why he helped a stranger when the whole town preferred to turn away. He said no one deserved to face danger alone and that life in the frontier was already harsh enough without people making it harder. Something in his tone made her believe him, and she closed her eyes again with a slow breath that sounded less afraid than before. While night surrounded the cabin, a horse galloped near the riverbank, stopping just far enough to avoid being seen. A dark silhouette dismounted and stared toward the cabin light, waiting, planning, and preparing for whatever came next. The story of the woman was not yet finished, and the cowboy was about to learn that protection came with a price, especially when the world decided a person should never escape their past. The night passed slowly, heavy like a storm cloud refusing to break. The woman woke with a start more than once, sometimes pulling the blanket close, as if afraid a hand might snatch it away. Each time, she saw the cowboy still near the table or staring out the small window, guarding the silence. When dawn finally touched the valley, the cabin felt safer than before, yet she carried a hidden fear that daylight would bring unwanted visitors or harsh questions she was not ready to answer. The cowboy prepared a small breakfast of dried meat and warm cornbread, but she barely ate. He did not push her. Hurt people often took time to trust food, shelter, or kindness, especially when those gifts were rare in their past. As sunlight crept over the grass, the cowboy saddled his horse. He told her he needed to speak with a friend in town to find out what stories were spreading. She asked if someone might follow or harm him because of her, but he shook his head gently and reminded her that fear would win only if they surrendered before knowing the truth. Before leaving, he placed a small knife on the table, not as a weapon to encourage harm, but as something that might help her feel protected if the cabin door rattled. She promised she would stay inside and not open for anyone until his return. The cowboy rode toward town, his eyes scanning every ridge and valley line. He smelled tension in the wind, the kind that showed when pride and suspicion mixed together. In town, people moved about their morning chores, but the moment he stepped toward the stable, hushed conversations stopped. A few men glanced at him with raised brows, as if measuring his motives. One older man near the feed store approached and asked if he had seen the wanderer girl near his land. The cowboy answered calmly that she needed rest and meant no harm. The man frowned and replied that strangers without known family or written records often brought trouble that spread like sickness. He warned that men from the other settlement might come soon to question everyone. The cowboy did not show fear, but his chest tightened. He realized that the world outside judged quickly and listened slowly at the saloon porch. Another rancher hinted that the girl carried bad luck, pointing to broken fences and a calf missing from a ranch 3 nights before. The cowboy reminded him that animals often wandered or fell prey to wolves, but they ignored logic. Rumor did not care for truth. Rumor only needed a frightened heart to feed on. One man even claimed she might be running because she tricked someone out of property. No one had proof, yet the ranchers at the poker table nodded like judges. The cowboy then left before his patience wore thin and went to find a friend, a calm blacksmith known for thinking before speaking. The blacksmith listened and finally spoke in a worried tone. He said that 3 armed men asked about the girl days ago at the other settlement, and no one knew what they wanted, but their anger seemed personal rather than lawful. The blacksmith ended by saying the cowboy should be careful, not because the girl was guilty, but because men who chased shadows often became dangerous. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, the young woman stood near the window, staring at the river while fighting thoughts that wanted to break her. She wondered if she should leave before she ruined the only shelter ever offered without demands. Each time she walked toward the door, she remembered the cowboy's steady voice, telling her she had the right to stay safe. She sat down, holding his coat close, wondering how a stranger could carry more kindness than all the people she once knew. She prayed silently for him to return without harm. As she waited, she noticed a soft rustling sound outside, close to the corner of the cabin. She froze, holding the knife while pressing her back against the wall. The sound stopped, then returned, as if something or someone circled the cabin slowly. She kept silent, breathing through her nose, fearing that a single sound would expose her location. After a long, tense moment, footsteps faded toward the river. She dared not look outside. Fear became heavier, settling deep like cold water. She wondered if it was an animal, the ranch hand, or someone else completely unknown. The cowboy finally returned near midday, his horse sweating and his face stern. She opened the door only after hearing his voice call her name softly. He stepped inside, closed the door, and told her they needed to talk. He shared what he learned, and she sank into the chair, covering her face with both hands. She whispered that the men were not searching for justice, but control. She explained that a wealthy trader near her old settlement had shown interest in taking her as part of a forced arrangement. She rejected him calmly, not expecting harsh consequences, but he did not accept refusal. He accused her of theft so he could claim her as repayment. She escaped with help from a kind older woman, but now it seemed he had spread lies to justify chasing her across the plains. The cowboy clenched his jaw, realizing she was running from power, not guilt. He did not promise easy solutions, but he promised he would stand by her until truth found a path. She thanked him quietly, but doubt remained because she had never met someone willing to stand beside her without reward. Later, began planning ways to protect her. He thought about asking the blacksmith for help, or sending a message to someone with legal authority. But the frontier did not work like big towns. Laws were thin, and justice often came from who had stronger backing, louder voices, or more bullets. The cowboy began thinking of taking her farther into the valley. Maybe near his distant trapping cabin hidden between tall rocks where no one traveled except hunters. She didn't want him to risk everything, but he reminded her that dignity was worth defending, even if it made life harder. As they discussed options, another subplot began forming quietly within the cabin. She learned small things about the cowboy's past, not through direct questions, but through subtle details. A folded photo rested inside his hat band, showing a woman holding a newborn, both smiling near a wagon wheel. When she asked who they were, he paused before answering. He said they were his wife and daughter, both lost to fever during a winter journey. He buried them under a tall oak near a frozen river, and since then, he kept to himself, believing he would never again feel needed in any human story. She lowered her gaze, understanding that his kindness came from a heart that once broke rather than a desire to gain anything in return. Outside, the river shimmered as clouds rolled in, hinting at rain. Two distant riders appeared near the far ridge, pausing to scan the land below. The cowboy saw them through the window crack and recognized danger from the way they sat in their saddles. Scanning rather than traveling, he did not tell the woman immediately, not wanting to frighten her into panic. Instead, he told her they would leave near dusk. Moving through the woods instead of riding openly on the trail, the woman, however, sensed something changing in his tone. She walked closer and asked if someone had already found them. He didn't lie. He told her strangers might arrive soon, but they still had time to think. She asked if he regretted helping her, but his answer was steady. He said regret belonged to people who chose silence when someone needed a voice. Time slowed again as evening approached. The woman packed only a few things, including the cowboy's coat, now feeling like a shield of safety. She looked around the cabin, fearing it would become another memory she must leave behind. She stepped outside, touched the wooden doorway gently, and prayed that one day she could return without fear. The cowboy saddled his horse while scanning the tree line. The sky darkened and wind swept through the valley. Carrying an uneasy message, somewhere between the trees a twig snapped, sharp and quick. The cowboy placed one hand on her back and whispered that they needed to move now. The woman mounted first, holding the saddle horn tightly, while he kept watch. As the horse stepped toward the narrow forest path, a voice echoed from the darkness behind them, calling out with slow cruelty, telling them that running would only make things worse. The true conflict had arrived, and nowhere felt far enough. The voice behind them sounded calm in a threatening way, as if the person speaking already believed he owned the outcome. The cowboy did not turn his head right away. He placed one foot in the stirrup while shielding the woman with his arm. The horse shifted uneasily, sensing danger in the air. The woman pressed her hands along the saddle horn, praying that fear would not make her fall. Darkness gathered fast across the woods, and the tall pines cast long shadows that moved with the wind, making it difficult to see who was calling. The cowboy whispered to her that they would ride slow into the trees and only turn fast if someone tried to stop them. She nodded without speaking, her throat tight as if words could break the small courage she managed to hold. They rode into the cover of branches, heading toward the deeper forest path that twisted near the rocky hills. The wind blew harder, brushing her hair across her face, making her blink back tears caused by wild air rather than sadness. The cowboy kept one hand near the reins and one near his belt, ready to protect without being the one to start a fight. Behind them, the sound of two horses began moving again. They were not rushing, only following, like hunters who believed their prey had nowhere better to go. The woman turned her head slightly, trying to confirm whether they were truly chasing or just watching. The cowboy told her to keep looking forward and trust his lead. The trail narrowed between rocks, forcing them to go single file. The cowboy moved ahead to clear branches while guiding the horse slowly. Leaves cracked under the hooves, and every sound felt sharper in the quiet woods. The woman tried to steady her breathing, feeling the fear pounding inside her chest, not only for herself but for the man who offered help without asking for anything back. She kept replaying his words about dignity and safety, wishing that she could repay him with strong courage of her own. But each rustle, each echo behind them, kept reminding her how small she felt against a world that seemed determined to claim her. Soon, the path ended at a small clearing near an old abandoned trapping hut. The structure looked weak, but still able to offer shelter for a short time. The cowboy decided it would be safer to wait inside until they could find a new plan. He helped her down from the horse, guiding her into the hut. She sat on a wooden crate while he checked the surroundings through a crack in the wall. The sky thundered without rain, adding to the tension that wrapped around them like wire. He told her to stay seated while he secured the horse behind the hut and covered it with branches so no one could spot it easily. When he returned, she was still holding his coat close, staring toward the small doorway like someone expecting the wind to form into a human shape. She asked him whether they would be found, and he replied with honesty rather than false comfort. He said they might be found, but being found did not mean giving up. He added that strength was not always measured by weapons or loud voices. Sometimes it came from a person refusing to bow when others tried to decide their worth. She looked at him with wide, grateful eyes, feeling something rising inside her that she had never experienced before. Not love at first sight, but a deep belief that maybe she was not broken after all. Moments later, the sound of horses again carried through the trees, closer now and no longer slow. The cowboy motioned for silence. They heard men speaking, though the words were faint. One voice sounded like the ranch hand from before, and another voice was unfamiliar, deeper and colder. The cowboy recognized the tone of someone used to getting what he wanted. The men discussed trails and directions, trying to figure where their targets had gone. The woman held her breath, pressing her hand against her own lips, her fingers shaking. She remembered the time she was nearly taken back by force, and all those shadows returned as if standing right behind her again. The cowboy put a finger near his mouth, signaling her not to move. The men stepped closer, one saying the horse tracks led through the woods and that they were not far. Another grumbled that she must be brought back no matter what, and if the cowboy refused, they would deal with him first. The woman gripped the crate edge so tight her knuckles turned pale. The cowboy stayed calm, but his eyes darkened with quiet resolve. He did not want to fight, but he understood that sometimes peace required standing firm. The horses rode past the hut, and the two held still. It felt like hours until the sound faded. When it finally grew quieter, she exhaled weakly, leaning against the wall. The cowboy approached her, saying they would move again after a short rest as the men might circle back. She whispered that she never wanted to involve him in her troubles, but he replied that trouble only grew stronger if good people stepped aside. She lowered her head, wiping tears with the back of her hand, ashamed that fear controlled her life so long. He placed one hand gently on her shoulder, not to push or hold, but to remind her she was not alone. They stayed inside until the sky faded into nightfall. Owls began calling, and the forest cooled. The cowboy decided they would travel up the rocky ridge to reach his hidden shelter far beyond the tree line, a place he used for winter trapping where almost no one wandered. They stepped out carefully, leading the horse through the dark. The ridge climb was steep and she struggled, slipping a few times, though he caught her each time without showing frustration. He told her she was stronger than she believed, and she whispered that she wished she could believe that too. Halfway up, they heard voices echoing through the canyon. The searchers were still nearby, determined and growing impatient. One of the men shouted that the woman would face consequences no matter who tried to help her, and he threatened to burn the land if required. The woman froze, believing she had brought danger to someone who did not deserve it. She begged the cowboy to leave her and ride away for his own safety. The cowboy refused with steady words, saying a person should not solve injustice by sacrificing themselves. As they pushed higher up the ridge, the storm finally broke. Heavy rain fell and thunder cracked across the valley. The trail turned muddy and slippery, making it harder to move quickly. The horse struggled, so the cowboy removed the saddlebags to lighten weight. Rain soaked through their clothes, but neither stopped. The woman kept repeating small words of prayer, hoping the storm might slow their pursuers. Lightning lit the sky in pale flashes, revealing two distant figures still climbing. Their shadows grew bigger each time lightning flicked, making it clear they would not stop until they reached their target. The cowboy and the woman finally reached the upper ledge, where a narrow opening between stones led to a small hidden shelter. He guided her inside, helping her sit near a small rock wall. The place was dry, with an old pile of wood stored in a corner. He quickly started a small fire to warm her. Her lips trembled from cold, but her eyes were strong now, fueled by something deeper than fear. She told him she would no longer run silently, and if she must speak the truth out loud to stop this chase, she would. Before he could answer, footsteps scraped against rock outside. The firelight flickered as the sound grew closer. The men were almost at the entrance. The cowboy stood, his eyes focused on the narrow doorway, while the woman rose behind him, gripping his coat with one hand, refusing to fall back into silence. The storm outside roared as the shadow of a man darkened the entrance, and the voice that followed carried both anger and final warning. Marking the moment before everything would change, the shadow in the doorway slowly took form as lightning, broke across the sky once more, showing the face of the traitor who had chased her across plains and settlements. His soaked hat dripped water down his coat, but his eyes held the same sharp claim that once filled her days with fear. Beside him stood the talkative ranch hand, shivering from rain, yet smirking as if victory stood only one breath away. The cowboy stepped forward, blocking the entrance with quiet strength, while the woman stood close behind him, no longer looking like someone waiting to be dragged into another chapter of misery. She had been running for too long, and her voice no longer felt like something meant to stay buried. Beneath silence, the traitor announced that the woman must return with him, claiming she was bound by a deal she never signed or agreed to. He insisted she owed him obedience for what he called shelter, clothing, and safety. The cowboy replied firmly, saying that kindness became worthless if it demanded chains in return. The traitor denied her right to speak, but she lifted her chin and answered in a steady tone that surprised even herself. She told him she was willing to honor fairness, but she never owed her life, her voice, or her freedom to any man who tried to use fear as a leash. She declared that her past was full of uncertainty, but that uncertainty did not make her property. The traitor grew angry, raising his hand as if to silence her again, but the cowboy stepped closer, not with violence or threat, but with unwavering resolve in his eyes. He told the traitor that if he wanted to prove a claim, he must show something true, not rumors whispered in dark corners or stories shaped to gain control. Lightning flashed again, and this time he saw something he had not noticed before. Around the woman's neck hung a small leather pouch she had carried since childhood, one she never opened because she feared holding a reminder of the life she never knew. The cowboy asked gently if she had ever looked inside, and she admitted that she never found the courage because she believed it contained the same pain. She spent years trying to escape at his request and with tremors running down her arms. She opened it slowly, revealing a small piece of cloth embroidered with a symbol that neither she nor the traitor recognized. The cowboy stared at it, his breath catching slightly as memory stirred. He remembered seeing the same stitching on a document hanging in the old courthouse office long ago. A document belonging to families who arrived during the early settlement years. It was not a sign of shame. It was a sign of identity. It meant she did not belong to a random path with no name, but to a family with recorded roots. She was not lost property. She was not stray fortune. She was a rightful individual with her own story tied to land and dignity. The traitor tried to dismiss it, but the cowboy told him he could ride with them at sunrise back to town, so everyone could hear the truth together. There would be no forced decisions, no threats, and no more whispering trails. The ranch hand hesitated, suddenly less sure about the man he followed. The storm rumbled on, making the mountains echo like distant drums. The traitor eventually lowered his voice, realizing he could not drag her away without exposing his intentions to the full community. He backed away from the entrance slowly, promising that the matter was not over. But he agreed to meet at the courthouse to settle it openly. He and the ranch hand left into the storm, no longer moving with triumphant steps, but with uncertain shadows following behind. When their footsteps finally faded, the woman crumpled to her knees with overwhelming relief, not because the fight was finished, but because for the first time, she did not face it alone. The cowboy lifted her gently, wrapping his coat around her shoulders as she cried quietly. Not out of fear, but out of release. He told her she had shown true courage by speaking for herself, and that was something no man could ever take from her again. They waited until dawn, warming by the fire and resting peacefully for the first time. When morning light touched the edge of the rocks, they began riding back toward town. The trail was calmer now, washed clean by rain, as if nature itself wanted to give them a fresh path. Birds flew overhead, and small rays of sun peeked through wet branches. The woman felt lighter, not because her burden vanished, but because she now carried it with a backbone instead of trembling hands. The cowboy rode beside her, guiding with patience rather than command. She thanked him again, but he told her that strength was not something she borrowed. It was something she discovered with the right person standing nearby. Upon reaching town, people gathered near the courthouse porch when word spread. The trader arrived too, no longer shouting but speaking with cautious tone. The blacksmith shop owners, mothers, ranch workers, and even young boys stood close, wanting to hear what had been hidden. The cowboy showed the embroidered cloth, and the blacksmith confirmed he had seen the same mark in the old settlement records. The sheriff brought the document, written long ago, stating that the symbol belonged to a family that had vanished during a river accident, leaving only a child unaccounted for. She was not a nameless traveler, but a rightful heir to a forgotten legacy. The crowd shifted, their eyes filling with remorse for how quickly judgment had replaced kindness. The trader tried to justify his actions. The town finally saw truth versus manipulation, and he was ordered to leave without further claims over her. The ranch hand lowered his head, ashamed, and walked away silently. Realizing he had chosen the wrong side of a story that sought power rather than fairness, people apologized, offering warm blankets, food, and a place to stay. But the woman chose instead to walk outside with the cowboy so they could speak freely. They reached the riverbank where it all began, and she stood there feeling the wind, not as an enemy, but as a companion. She looked at him with gentle eyes and asked why he cared so deeply. The cowboy smiled softly, saying he once wished someone had saved his wife and child when sickness struck, and that even though he could not change his past, he could honor it by protecting someone else's future. She placed her hand on his, not out of need but gratitude. She decided to stay near the valley, not as a wandering stranger, but as a rightful member of the land. With help from kind townsfolk, she rebuilt her life, found work, and slowly became known for strength, not mystery. The cowboy continued living near the creek, but now he was not alone. They spent evenings on the porch, sharing stories and finding peace in each other's company. Their bond grew naturally like wildflowers that bloom without guidance, built on trust rather than fear. In time, she turned her past into a story meant to inspire, not haunt. She learned that even broken journeys lead somewhere meaningful when met by truth, courage, and compassion. And as people spoke about her life, they no longer whispered. They spoke with respect, for in the old American frontier, legends were not born from battles alone, but from hearts that chose honor over silence, and from strangers who became family by choosing kindness when the world offered none.